Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Inside segment. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, Juneteenth 2025. It was 4 years ago today that June 17th, 2021, then President Joe Biden signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day into law, making June 19th a federal holiday. Well, today there is some concern about the future of the celebration and how it will be recognized under the Trump administration, which has banned DEI in the federal government. Now, that includes removing Black history content from federal websites. And joining me to talk about this year's celebration, one of the key people who fought to make Juneteenth a national holiday, my guest is Steve Williams, president of the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation. Steve, thanks for talking to us again during this important time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Harold, very much for having me on your show.
Sure, no problem. Let me first talk about the elephant in the room with rising political tensions and cultural pushback around discussions of race and history. Have you faced any resistance to Juneteenth programming this year?
I and our foundation individually have not faced any pushback because we make it about history and about American history. And Title V is the highest type of holiday for which you can attribute 1, 2 to 3 different levels. But we are aware of pushback on that around the country because we seal it. So we've known pushback everything from the Denver celebration being scaled back from 3 days to 1 day. And Denver's had a long celebration on 5 points with Daddy Bruce Randolph that goes back to the 60s and the 70s. So this is the first time they didn't get the corporate funding, but no federal pushback. We've heard about pushback in Michigan and some other places, a little bit in Nevada, but not really, ourselves personal because how we carry Juneteenth as an American holiday, not an African American holiday, but an American holiday.
To what do you attribute the pushback in certain spots around the country?
I attribute it to human nature. If people who have personal biases and prejudices will find an excuse to do things that they want to do or that they don't necessarily agree with. And so that's part of the challenge. I mean, everything that's an infant, if you think of Juneteenth, it's a 5-year-old. We're coming up on his 5th birthday. For those like me that's in our family that's been fighting for a long time, we have a definition. But that federal national definition is still in its infancy. So it's a lot of work left ahead to be done.
Are you concerned about the future of the Juneteenth holiday under the Trump administration? Is there a possibility that it could be taken away?
No, the Juneteenth was what they call a Title V federal holiday. It's the same as the 4th of July. It was passed with more consent than the 4th of July. Actually, it was unanimously passed by the Senate and overwhelmingly passed by the House of Representatives. Yes, there were some objections to it, the process and the procedure, which we did, the naming, which was a problem to some people, but they ended up voting for it because they knew it was the right thing to do. So overwhelmingly supporting the federal holiday, and Juneteenth is about that. Our foundation is about bringing all Americans together. It's not necessarily about trying to beat somebody over the head and making them feel guilty. That's not going to get us where we need to go.
Talk to me about the central theme behind this year's observance of Juneteenth.
This year's theme is Together We Ride the Juneteenth Wave of Freedom to Liberty. That's a mouthful, but it says a lot, okay? We had in the past the Juneteenth wave of freedom, the wave of freedom. And we know that freedom came in a wave. But where was that wave leading to? That wave leads to liberty, the exercise of your freedom. The only way we're going to do that is together. Together, not only as Black people, but as Americans. The only way we are going to get ourselves economically viable as Black people, Americans in America is together, right? It's one thing to boycott something. It's another thing to pool your resources. That's what I mean by together cooperation. So it's the get together part that we've got to really work on. And that's being brought to the forefront by what's taking place on Capitol Hill. You know, pull out funding from us, that's together. A little short story. We have a local Juneteenth Loudon, Juneteenth Loudon in Loudoun County, Virginia. I'm in
Mhm.
Leesburg. And because I live there, you know, I live in Loudoun County, I lend my resources. So I had my friend Hezekiah Watkins come up from Mississippi to speak to the youth because the youth are very concerned about everything that's going on. Now, if you don't know, Hezekiah Watkins was the youngest of the Freedom Riders, thrown into prison and on death row when he was 13 years old, right? Kept their attention wholeheartedly. But he let them understand that freedom right and civil rights movements that he was involved in. And understand, Hezekiah wrote with John Lewis. He was with Martin Luther King. He was with these people. They knew him because of his mere circumstance. And he's letting them know that now is not the time to quit, and now is not the time to end fighting. So that's the message that we have to get out, is that the only way we're going to do this is together, young and old, left and right. We got to work together.
You know, one of the things that often happens because this is a young federal holiday is that for people who don't work, who take the day off, and they may be in a store or they may be, out in public, and they may run into, somebody that they may be acquainted with, let's say a white person. And they say, "Oh, you're not working today?" Well, it's a holiday. "Oh, what holiday is it?" "Well, it's Juneteenth." "What's that?" But the thing that surprises me is that there are black people, people of color, who are not really familiar with that. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Maybe some people live under rocks. Um, but if you wouldn't mind giving me, just kind of the story of Juneteenth, from Emancipation Proclamation to Galveston, and and just kind of explain, because I think it's always important. There's always the one person who may be listening to this conversation who does not know or does not
Mhm.
really understand the full context.
So yeah, that's great. Juneteenth is an American story. Um, so there's troops, black troops that are called the United States Colored Troops. They picked up the slack at the end of the Civil War. They actually trapped General Lee at Appomattox, and then after his surrender, of course, they were headed back in Virginia to their camp. At this time, the South wasn't really ready to quit, even though General Lee surrendered and everything's ready. In Texas, even though they were aware of everything, they were still trying to find it out. There was a guy by the name of Maximilian I, the Emperor of Mexico. He was going through Mexico and taking everything that wasn't glued down, putting it on a boat, and sending it back to Napoleon during the French Revolution. These Texans contacted him and said, "Will you please come help us?" This is the same Maximilian that caused Cinco de Mayo. Cinco de Mayo and Juneteenth are siblings because of him. He's headed towards Texas. General Grant gets news of this. Now you got to understand, slow moving, big army. You all the way in Mexico City. You're not getting there in a week or so, right? You're not. There's no roads. There's none of that stuff there. He's got to fight. So he's working his way towards Texas. General Grant hears this. He wants to send a show of force. He wants to send some soldiers, a show of force there to prevent Maximilian from connecting with these rebel Texans, right? So he contracts every single ship that's possible and have them come into Cityport, present day Hopewell, Virginia. And he loads these U.S. colored troops who still got 2 years left on their contracts to serve. He puts them on these ships, and these guys are good because they march through the day and night. And he sends them to the border of Texas and Mexico. So that's what the plan was. They get into the Gulf of Mexico, they run into a storm. Let me back up. They leave out of Hopewell, Virginia. They're headed down. They pick up their commanding officer, General Granger, in Mobile, Alabama. He picks up 5 general orders for him to execute in the port of New Orleans. They head from the port of New Orleans to Arenas Bar on the Texas-Mexico border. They can't land the boat because of the storms in the seas. So they can't get to Padre Island or anything over there. So they end up going and pulling into Galveston Bay on the 18th. When they get there, these ships, the people who got on first are going to be the first chance to get off because they got to refuel, they got to get food. These guys have been on the boat since May 25th. Okay, it's now June 18th. Okay, they've been on the boat since then. They get to there and they see these black sailors in the harbor, and the sailors are telling them like, "Hey, man, they won't let us off the boat up there." These brothers ain't taking it, so they get ferried in and they get off. The commanding officer, General Granger, is taking care of a lot of paperwork. He's trying to review a lot of things. His second in command, named F.W. Emory, takes the soldiers and they go off the boat. Emory's seeing and hearing all this stuff. These brothers now have got themselves together. They got their uniforms on. They're marching through the streets of Galveston, right? Emory is with them. They post General Order Number 3 on the door of the colored church, present-day Reedy Chapel, right? And it's handed out in handbills throughout different places in Texas. Now, the first part of the general order is tell them that all slaves are free. Mm-hmm. All slaves are free. And then Emory writes the second part, working for wages, staying in places. He's an abolitionist, right? Absolute equality. He writes the second part and he signs the order because he executes it. Now, the people in Galveston are pretty much aware of what's going on. They know they had a watch night. They knew they were free. They just were getting worked by the slave masters until these black soldiers come marching through the streets and informing everybody that they're free. This spirit that took place rose up on this day, June 19, 1865. They were only there for about 2 or 3 days before they went back, and they eventually helped the Mexican army trap Maximilian, and he was executed on June 19, 1867. So shout out to our Latino brothers. But that spirit is what they took from them. From Juneteenth, those brothers who had that spirit that were there, they went on to become the 9th and 10th Cavalry, known as the Buffalo Soldiers. They were the first border guards. They were first National Park Rangers. And everything they did, they took that spirit with them. Juneteenth was never about Texas, although Texas made it seem like it. The oldest holidays are in New York, are in Illinois. The longest running holidays are in California. And you can look and see where these Buffalo Soldiers, these military men, these soldiers, when they left, they took that, they never forgot that. They never forgot it. Whether they were stationed in Utah or they were building the Alcon Highway to Alaska, they never forgot that Juneteenth moment. And so that's the
Steve,
story.
Yeah, and it's such an important story. You know, fast forward to tomorrow, you've got an event at the National Press Club. Briefly tell me about that because I've got to go to a break in about a minute.
Yes, the National Prayer Breakfast at the National Press Club was usually held on Juneteenth in the morning by the Reverend Ronald V. Myers, Sr., MD, the late Doc Myers. And this is where Juneteenth became a federal holiday. So, yes, we're there. This 26 years, it's been running consistently. We've had senators, congressmen, presidents there at Juneteenth briefing. This is where it's at. If you're interested, dcjuneteenth.org. Tickets are there available. But this is where it was done at. This is where the federal holiday was wrapped up.
dcjuneteenth.org?
Yep.
And what time is it tomorrow morning at the National Press Club?
It's at 8 o'clock in the morning tomorrow morning. Our speaker is Rick Murphy, President General of the First African Society. So they trace their lineage back to those 20 and some odd Africans that landed in 1619 on August 25th.
Wonderful. Steve, hang in there. We are going to take a quick break, but don't forget you can hear this in every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. This conversation continues on Sirius XM, channel 141 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation about the upcoming Juneteenth federal holiday, but we're also asking tonight, is it at risk? My guest is Steve Williams, president of the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation. You know, Steve, we are in a interesting time. I'm sure it is also not, lost on you that, for example, today is the 10th anniversary of the massacre at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. When you think about the importance of this struggle to make Juneteenth, a holiday, and the struggle that Black people in America are still dealing with. Talk to me about the parallels, if you could.
That is very interesting when you talk about the parallels, because we've been struggling with a parallel here. May 25th is Shove-Off Day. That's the day that those men started boarding ships to head towards the Texas-Mexico border. May 25th is also the day that George Floyd was murdered. I'm thinking about that. It's Selwyn George, his uncle, and his aunt, we have just become connected in the last 2 years. The Black Lives Matter movement had nothing to do with Juneteenth legislation. That's the media. The media concocted that. It never was brought up by a legislator. I didn't know anybody with them. They didn't contribute to our movement. There was no connection there. Nobody even thought about it. The legislation was based upon the work of Doc Myers. Doc Myers brought Juneteenth to 43 different states and the District of Columbia. And so there was no connection there, but now we have a connection of these two events, a parallel. We got this great event that happened one day and this horrific event that happened another day. This is America. This is what we struggle with, particularly in America, that is unique. This good and bad, this journey. That's why how we survive through improvisation, improvising our way through things is critical. It's critical. How we handle things. We can't look at anything and say it's all rosy, and we can't look at everything and say it's all horrible. We've got to craft our way through this and make it better. And if we don't do it, and if we don't come to the terms for it ourselves as a people, the microcosm of American society, America's not going to be able to do it.
It's interesting that you say that we have to be strategic, that we have to craft our way through this. As of this moment, we have yet to see any recognition officially from the White House of this Juneteenth celebration. Now, certainly it's 2 days from now. It is quite possible that we could see something tomorrow. We could see something on Thursday. But considering the current political climate, considering that DEI efforts are under attack, how do you believe that Juneteenth should serve as a counter narrative to those rollbacks? Black people want to celebrate Juneteenth loud and clear, but if this kind of celebration of things that this administration is pushing back, shutting down, closing out, gets wind of, what impact do you think there might be? How should we navigate this?
Well, let's kind of clear the air here. We have a 400-year on African American History and Culture Commission, right?
Yes.
You know who signed that into law? Donald Trump did.
Yeah, but
hold on, Harold. Hold on, Harold.
No, hold on. Let me ask
Hold
you.
on.
Let me ask a question. Was that during his first term?
Yeah, that was during his first term.
First term after he visited Blacksonian. Is that correct?
No,
It was before?
somewhere along the line, but that
Yeah,
wasn't.
it was I seem to
It,
remember
that wasn't the influencing factor in getting it done. I was involved with that from the very beginning. Calvin Pearson, the founder of Project 1619, who pushed for that commission, who was excluded from that commission by the Obama administration, right? So it's when you get to politics, it's a lot more complicated than that. But
okay.
what I would say was this: as this Title V holiday is, and he had put out statements. I was there in 2017. We were just left the Pentagon when he called Dr. Myers at the hotel to wish him well. I answered the phone. I gave it to Dr. Myers. Doc had worked there. So I think that there's a lot more going on here than this present. I'm not afraid about the holiday being canceled. I am concerned about it growing right. This is youth. If you look back and study every holiday that's there, even the 4th of July had a problem in the beginning. So the development of this federal holiday and how it's going to be executed is going to be up to a lot of people, primarily those people who are members of the National Juneteenth, because we have to shape it. A lot of people don't understand that it's an American holiday. They're trying to put it into a box. And we studied it. Much like Black History Month isn't what it's supposed to meant to be. Dr. Pritchard did not create that to be a history lesson. It was about arts and culture, but it's got twisted around. So, we have to try to set a path. I say this like this. In Judaism, they have a thing called the four questions. The four questions you won't find in the Bible, but it's a tradition that has kept Passover and the Jewish people together forever, right? And everybody knows, no matter what type of Jew you are, whether you're a Semitic Jew or a Khazar or whatever, you know the four questions. And that establishes the whole culture of Passover. Juneteenth needs that. It needs that establishment, and everything is going to grow based off of that. And we're at a historic moment right now, and that historic moment is something that I would like to spend more time talking about because it's bigger history than most people know where we're at and what's going on, and it might shed some insight into what's really going on.
But before you do that, because I wanted to add context to my question, because the Trump administration of the first Trump administration this is not the same. This is
No.
not the same. We saw during back in January the immediate elimination, for example, of the heroic contributions of the Tuskegee Airmen, wiped from the Department of Defense's website. It was wiped from the Air Force Academy's website, only to be replaced. Okay, and I guess my conversation about where we are now using that example is that prior to this new administration, the removing the Tuskegee Airmen was never a question. But then it happened, and now and then it came back, and I guess that's the kind of thing that I mean when you're talking about Arlington National Cemetery and the removing of the accomplishments of women, not all women, Black women, white women who served, who made the ultimate sacrifice, and I'm just talking about the military.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I ask about the concern. We want to have our federal government to recognize the contributions and the challenges of history as it relates to Black people in this country? Because yes, Black people are always going to do it, just as you were talking about, the 4 questions in the Jewish community. Whether the federal government recognizes it or not, the Jewish community is going to recognize this. And I guess the point that I'm making as it relates to the question is, even though we're going to do it, we still want our federal government to also recognize that? And is that important?
It's extremely important for that to happen, but it has to be corrected. And we
Okay.
have often talked about his story, right? His story. And we've suffered through a lot of that. And that's one of the points where we're at right now. I believe that the pendulum swung too far left, and now it's swinging too far right. And so it's going to take a little bit for it to get centered where we're correct. The vast majority of us are center left, center right people, right? But the pendulum has swung too far. And like I said earlier, those people who saw opportunity to exercise their personal biases and seeing as this a leeway, they took advantage from that. Thus, they took down and hit 60 airmen. They had to put it back up. That's not what the
Right.
directive said. Those people who are answering looked at the directive and said, "Oh, I want to label this DEI. I want to label that DEI. Anything
Right.
like that." But it's not there. And I have a lot of friends who are professionals. I'm a professional playing, and I talked to them and I said, listen, DEI was never about us. You are a top person in Booz Allen Hamilton. You're a top person in this and this and this in your field. You work here. Are you there because you're Black? Or are you there because you're good? And 100% there. I'm good. I know you're good. You're one of the best. That's the reason why you're there. So I think a lot of it is a distraction, but a lot of it is warranted because it shows the true color of who is there. So that's why we need to be alert. We need to look at the true colors of those people who are going to take something and run too far to the left or run too far to the right, and then understand where we have to put them at for the good of the country, for the good of ourselves, for the good of America. We can't be too far one way or the other. So that's my concern.
You were talking about before my last question about the bigger story. The what does that look like?
Listen, the bigger story is on June 20th, we would have been free, Juneteenth, 13th Amendment, longer than we would have been in chattel slavery. That's the bigger story. That's something that's happening all around us, okay, in the environment, the change. If you look from 1705 to 1865, it's 160 years. 1705, they said, because of the axiom, partus sequitur ventrum, you are of your mother, you are now chattel slaves for life. The formalization of chattel slavery was 1705 in the slave codes. The 13th Amendment and Juneteenth brought in a new era 160 years later. Here, 2025, we're at 160 years from that point. Now, whether you want to call it whatever, mysticism, spirituality, numbers, or whatever, we are now about to, that's why things are in such a turmoil. We are ready to enter into a new state. America's original sin, America's own self-inflicted nonsense, okay, is reaching a point to where we have to make a decision on what those people, are going to do. And that's going to be up to us, how we handle it. And when I mean us, I'm talking about those descendants whose mothers were subjected to partus sequitur ventrum, which means you are no longer have the rights of your father, whether you be English or Black, you are of your mother. That whole concept that brought us to where we're at chattel slavery. We are now at a point where we can take a step forward. So they pull funding out from us to make us stand on our own. So they take things away from us to make us be a community on our own. We were a lot better off on our own and in ourselves in the 50s and the 60s before we integrated. So it's not necessarily a thing for us to look at bad. Black Wall Street in Oklahoma wasn't by itself. It was a connection of 60 Black towns that contributed to it. Look at what I'm saying. We have a chance to set a new start, a new avenue. We have to work together. We have to cooperate with each other. We have to do that both in thought, mind, and finances.
So
We have
then let
to.
me, but if that is the case, so let me ask you this question then, because we started off this conversation saying that Juneteenth is an American holiday. Uh, if that is true, then it is a holiday for all Americans. But as you know, not all Americans are comfortable with the story of Juneteenth. And indeed, with the uh, attack on DEI, however misnamed it may be as it relates to Black history, there is a large segment of the population of this country that doesn't want to discuss anything about chattel slavery. The president has said this country began in 1775, not in 1619. And there are other leaders in this country uh, who have given, the role that African Americans and the enslaved have played in this country. So how do you cross over from Juneteenth being seen as an American holiday?
Well, Juneteenth is the actualization of the American promise, the Constitution. Because when you look at it and understand, by the ending of chattel slavery in America gave way to everything else. Before Juneteenth, it was white men and everybody else. White men, property owners, than everybody else. Even the Bill of Rights was set up, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution was set for white men than everybody else. Women's rights, children's rights, equal rights, civil rights, gay rights, it all came in the wake of and on the tail of and using Juneteenth. It's an American holiday. It is the fruition. It's like this. You got the 4th of July and Juneteenth. The 4th of July is freedom, Juneteenth is liberty. The 4th of July freed the land, Juneteenth freed the people. 4th of July freed the land from the tyranny of Britain. Juneteenth freed everybody from the tyranny of slavery. Everything is there. It's a matter of understanding that. When you don't know, you don't do well. But when you know better, you should do better.
But my
And that's
question,
the
Steve,
part.
is, and I understand that. I agree with you.
They have to understand that too. Then they'll agree. If they don't know,
Do
they don't know.
and that's my question. Do they? Because again,
They don't know.
right, you don't know. It's
They,
one
they,
thing
they
not
don't
to know.
know. In general,
It's
they
it's a,
don't
it's
know.
a, it's another thing not to want to know. And I
Yeah,
think
it can be a headache. It can be a headache because you're like, oh, this stuff again. But then when you tie it to your own personal liberties, that's like my friends who are Ethiopians who come here and they look kind of at us differently because of how we do things. I remind them that the Battle of Adwar, your inspiration came from those United States colored troops, those Juneteenthers. That's where it came from.
hmm,
When they look at it, they say, so it's about people knowing. When people don't know and they get this media fed frenzy of inaccuracy, right? Because it's just shout. I mean, it's not you guys' fault. You guys aren't historians. You guys don't, you're journalists, right? You don't have the time to dig in. If you sit there and you read Journal Order number 3, how are you going to sit there and dissect F.W. Emory signed it? And what is this congregation about? These are the freedom contraband camps that Black people knew. The whole story about that's printed in the media about Juneteenth is wrong, but yet it's right in front of your faces, right? It's right in front of you. All the discrepancies from the story about Granger on a villa reading this, none of it makes any sense, but it's right there. But nobody's bothered to correct it. I'm not blaming. I'm blaming media, but I don't expect anymore because you guys are journalists. You're not historians. That was a whole
that
problem with the Time magazine part. So it's up to getting a connection. It's like the federal government when it comes to technology and legislation. There's a big gap in between what they legislate, they think is happening, and what is actually happening. What is actually the history and what is actually being reported through the media, there's a big gap through it. There's always a big gap. Even in Hollywood, it gets even worse. So, and that's the point. Point blank.
Yeah.
We hear about the Massachusetts 54th, but we
Yeah.
don't never hear about the Kansas 1st, which was a unit that won their battle the day before. Historic. They changed the whole tide of the Civil War, but they're going to give us the Massachusetts 54th. Why? Because all of them, except for the flag bearer, the flag armor, died. That's like Nate Turner and Crispus Attucks. They did their role, but for each one of those examples, there's examples of people who won and lived. Lemuel
Mhm.
Haynes was there. And when they talk about starting 1775, in a document, if you look and see, the biggest complaint that Thomas Jefferson had in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence was Lord Dunsmore telling the enslaved people in America to kill the Americans and take over their property. That was the biggest complaint and the major driver behind the Declaration of Independence. They don't know.
And certainly that makes sense.
They don't know it. Lord Dunsmore said, hey, kill the Americans and I'll set you free and you can have their land. And they did. Everybody from Colonel Ty, it was a big problem. That's what comes to black people in Nova Scotia. Because when the Britain lost, they had to move them up there. So
which brings me
they
to
don't know. It's nonsense.
Well, that brings me to my next question, because and I'm repeating myself, but in a different context. There is myth and legend of the history of this country. There were things that I learned in school, in public school, that were at best incomplete.
Yes.
And thank God for the HBCUs, and more specifically, the Howard universities, and of course now, Blacksonian, and some of the other places. Yeah, where history, where we have museums and monuments and documents and everything. But how do we educate children, all children, not just Black children, but because they need it too, certainly. But how do you educate, all children? And I can speak to this, and I've mentioned this before, having taken a white friend who was an adult to Blacksonian, and coming out of the museum, and the first thing that she said was, "I've been lied to." This is an adult, and so there is still, let's be honest, there's still a whole lot of lying when it comes to, you can call it myth, you can call it legend, whatever, but there's still a whole lot of lying when it comes to American history, which includes Black history, and specifically Juneteenth. So how do we cross, that barrier? What do you say?
Systemic racism starts. One of the things it does, it starts in the writing of books. Who's writing the history books, which are making it into our schools, right? And not to understand that everybody was involved in the making of this country, right? And so we have to be diligent in making sure that our young people come up and get involved into education, get involved into writing, get involved into integrating that, because we were definitely involved in everything from the time when we landed here, 20 some odd Africans who weren't supposed to be here, right? And their contributions that they made to this country all the way through every single war. I mean, the person with the most amount of letters of recommendation, letters of honor in the Revolutionary War was a Black man by the name of Salem Ford. He was a hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill. So, he led it, and these guys were so amazed behind him that they wrote it. So, how do we find this information out? How do we get it into people's hands? How do we make it mainstream part of America that was there? And how do we get the content? Well, we have to tell our story and maintain the narrative. It's like understanding how Josiah Henson went from being the king of the Underground Railroad, saving thousands of people, training them in Don Canada, his book, his writings inspired, and some people say is the reason for the Civil War. How did his name and that book, Uncle Tom, get from being the highest acclaim that it was in a myriad of time to get to be turned upside down? How did that happen? Okay.
So let me ask you this, because I'm almost.
I was going to make my point. Okay, go ahead.
No. And this is important. Do you believe that that is the future of Juneteenth celebrations, not just the day off, the federal holiday, but an opportunity to educate everyone, but particularly Black people who need to know the details of not only Juneteenth, but all of the things that have to do with it? Is that the future of Juneteenth?
The future of Juneteenth is really what it is. It's economic. That's the real future. The culture part is what you're talking about. The real future of Juneteenth is understanding that when we were fighting for the Juneteenth holiday, at one point, we showed the direct connection between Juneteenth and Black Wall Street. Even so much so that they wrote it into the findings with the last bill before we actually had no findings in it. That's the future of Juneteenth, is economics. The future of understanding who we are and our roles is not only history, but it's culture, right? It's both. And so that's the future of what you would say Black History Month would be. That would be the future of that. Juneteenth is an opportunity to look at that. But Juneteenth in its truest form is truly about economics. It's about banding together. In Houston, the first thing they did was put the money together to buy a park so they could celebrate Juneteenth in peace. 7 to 12 men got together and bought a park so they could celebrate Juneteenth in peace. And that park is still there. That's the flex of the true power of cooperation and working together. All the Black towns, all the Black Wall Streets around the country, those are all the core of Juneteenth. The freedom part that led for everybody else, that is done its job. It's done its job for America, right? It's doing its job for America. Because I said before that, everything rides on the wave there, on that wave. But now we have to really look at what Juneteenth is, the celebration of freedom, and the exercise of that freedom is liberty. And how can you be more liberated than to have economic liberty? So that's where the real future of Juneteenth is at. And going back to one thing I wanted to say.
See, unfortunately,
one last thing I wanted to say.
I'm out of time. I'm out of time. I gotta go. But that last point, I think, is the best way to end this conversation. But we will talk again, as we always do, and not just on Juneteenth. I appreciate your knowledge and your intellect on this topic. Happy Juneteenth, Steve, and thank you so much.
Harold. Thank you very much.
All right. That is the Daily Drum for this Tuesday, June 17th. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.